Welcome to another Roadway Wiz webinar presentation. Today we're going to take a look at the city of Wichita, Kansas, and the southern part of the Sunflower State. Joining me tonight to help out is Laura Bianca Pruitt of mdroads.com. Hi, Laura.
Hey Dan, how are you?
Ah, how could I be bad? Really, I'm doing fantastic.
That's right.
So we got a lot of stuff to get to tonight, so let's dive right in. So, Wichita, sometimes known as the air capital of the world. Believe it or not, it is actually the largest city in Kansas. A lot of people associate Kansas City as the major metro in the state of Kansas, and they would be right. By metro population, it's the largest. However, Wichita, by its city population of 400,000, is a top 50 city in the country by population, and its MSA is the largest, located exclusively within the state of Kansas.
Did
Wichita,
not realize it was. Oh, did not realize it was the top 50.
yeah, I was surprised that it was that high as well. Um, but yeah, that was an interesting discovery, and yeah, a lot of people assume that Kansas, is the largest city in the Sunflower State, but no, that actually it's Wichita.
Yeah.
Um, Wichita began as a trading post on the old Chisholm Trail in the 1860s. The settlement was established in 1868 at the confluence of the Arkansas and Little Arkansas rivers, and Wichita was incorporated as a city in 1870. Its location on the Chisholm Trail made it a noteworthy destination for cattle drives traveling north from Texas to meet the railroads, the transcontinental east-west railroads that passed through Kansas. And they set up shop in Wichita. And so Wichita had an early nickname in the 19th century as Cowtown. Over the years into the 20th century, Wichita rapidly industrialized and became a hub for the aircraft industry, especially during World War II. And this led to its nickname Air Capital of the World. To this day, companies such as Learjet, Airbus, and Boeing continue to operate design and manufacturing facilities in Wichita. Several airports are located within the area to facilitate this purpose, most notably McConnell Air Force Base and Dwight D. Eisenhower National Airport. There has been one road meet in Wichita over the years. This was the meet photo from 2011's Wichita Road Meet.
Look at that fine group of people. Is there anybody that we recognize that's been on the show?
Yeah, I recognize a few people actually in this picture.
As, as do I. I see David Golub in the bottom right corner.
Is that him? I don't know if that's him. Corco is front and center.
I know. Corco looks so young.
I know, right? And then he moved to Connecticut, and that's when he started getting gray hair.
Oh, that'll do it. Well, I don't know. Well, now you have me questioning. Maybe that's not David Golub in the
No, that's
bottom
not.
right.
No, that's not David Golub. He's never been this far west before.
Oh,
I can't tell who that is, but yeah, it's definitely not him.
yeah. Anybody else that's been on the show?
Um, I think that's it. I mean, there are others I recognize, but yeah, Corco's the only one who's been actually a panelist on the program before.
Yeah, I think that is that Gene kneeling in the front
Yeah, Gene's in the
center,
front. Yeah,
and then
to
let's see
his
who else.
to his left, I think is Jonathan Winkler.
Oh
To
yeah,
Corco's right is Cody, I think.
yes, Cody Goodman.
And to his left is Eric Stuve, and then HB is in the top right.
Yep, H.B.
Those
Elkins.
are the ones that I recognize off the bat.
Yeah.
You know, back when everybody was young and good looking.
Hey, we're all still young and good looking,
Well,
right?
we might be good looking still, but we're a little less young now.
A little less young. Yeah, I'll go with that. I'm only 37 years young.
Hey, you know, we're not doing too bad for our age.
That's right.
So the historic Chisholm Trail that I talked about a moment ago, it kind of, if you follow it out of its historic route from Texas up to Kansas. It roughly follows what's nowadays U.S. Highway 81, which starts
Yes.
out in Fort Worth at the old stockyards in Fort Worth, which are still there to this day, passing north through Oklahoma, through the Oklahoma City area, and then up into southern Kansas from there.
Yes. I have notes on that. But yeah, like so through Oklahoma, especially if, the route of US 81 follows the Chisholm Trail through present-day towns of El Reno, Duncan, Chickasha, and Enid. Hopefully I pronounced all those correctly. And then also there was a point, so basically, I'll talk a little more about the Chisholm Trail, but there was, as the railroads kept, going further south, the point, the end of the Chisholm Trail also would end further south. And so also Caldwell, Kansas was one of those points, south of Wichita, also on US 81. But as far as the Chisholm Trail goes, it was a trail used in the post-Civil War era to drive cattle overland from ranches in southern Texas, from either the Rio Grande area or San Antonio, crossed the Red River into what was then called Indian Territory, and ended at Kansas rail stops. The trail encompassed a pathway established by Lenape leader Black Beaver in 1861, and a wagon road established by Jesse Chisholm, who was of Cherokee and Scottish descent, around 1864. And by 1869, the entire trail from Texas to Kansas became known as the Chisholm Trail. Basically, in Texas, you had hundreds of feeder trails that headed north into one of the main trails. The Chisholm Trail was previously used by Native Americans for hunting and raiding parties. And so historians consider the Chisholm Trail to have started at either Donna or San Antonio. And then from 1867 to 1871, the trail ended in Abilene, Kansas. And then, as I mentioned, as the railroads incrementally built southward, then it moved. And that's when it moved to Newton, and then soon afterwards to Wichita. And then from 1883 to 1887 was when the end of the trail was in Caldwell. As far as the trips themselves went, these trips took up to 2 months, and the cattlemen and one cattlewoman, who I'll talk about too, faced many difficulties. They had to cross the Arkansas River, the Red River, as well as lots of smaller creeks, deal with lots of different topographical challenges. They had to start in the spring after the rains stimulated the growth of grass for the grazing cattle. But then also, you had on the flip side, there being a lot of rain, higher water levels meant that there was more danger at the river crossings. And then also, the half-wild Texas Longhorn cattle were contrary and prone to stampeding with little provocation. But then also, they had to time it with the days of longest sunlight, as well as dealing with, in addition to natural dangers, you had cowboys, as well as occasional conflicts with Native Americans. The cattle drives actually disrupted the hunting and cultivation of crops in Indian Territory. And tribal members demanded that the trail bosses pay a toll of 10 cents per head to local tribes for the right to cross then Indian lands. The only woman who was known to run her own cattle drive traveled from Texas to Wichita using the Chisholm Trail. Her name was Margaret Borland. She took her family, hired hands, and 2,500 longhorns through the trail in 1873 in search of profit for her cattle, which was worth triple in Kansas over Texas prices. She unfortunately died from trail fever just after arriving in Wichita after an otherwise successful journey. But this trail is part of, this whole idea of like the free range, and it's like the song Home on the Range. And, you had these runs, as Dan said, to get the cattle to the Transcontinental Railroad. But then as the railroads continued further south, you didn't need the trail as much anymore. But then also with the invention of barbed wire was when you also had less of these open ranges and people starting to cordon off their farms and ranches. That's kind of like a little primer on the Chisholm Trail.
I think that was a good overview.
Yeah.
One of the many historic trails that is still really reasonably well signed. If you're on the local road system, a lot of the old byways out this part of the country are still well marked.
Now, have you driven much of US 81 in that part?
Not the section between Dallas and Wichita.
Oh, okay.
We'll talk about a section of US 81 I have driven in a little bit, but not the
Oh, awesome.
not the historic section. No.
Okay. Well, maybe after you clinch the interstate highway system, you might have to go clinch some old trails.
I know. I'm going to have a whole U.S. highway system ahead of me to do after this.
Yes, you are.
I'm gonna have to get busy. Here's some pictures of the Arkansas riverfront in downtown Wichita. Some really lovely green space around here. Of course, this is also an area that's very much in Tornado Alley out this way. So, um, one of the larger metropolises in this part of the country to be, squarely in the crosshairs of severe weather season every spring.
Hmm.
But it is still a very lovely area to visit.
Absolutely.
I gotta tell you, I was not expecting it to be as pleasant as it was. So,
Oh,
yeah, I mean, it just, well, you hear the stereotypical discussion about flyover country, and
right.
there are a lot of cities I've been to in between the two coasts. A lot of them are pretty forgettable, but no, actually, Wichita is actually quite lovely. So it's one that not a lot of people know about. I feel because it's not really on a
Yes.
major crossroads. It's not like Oklahoma City, which is at the crossroads of two cross country interstates. Um, it's not like Sioux Falls, South Dakota, which is like well off the beaten path. It has a certain charm to it, which I really like, and I like some of the architecture as well with some of the downtown buildings, like the ones on this particular slide.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a pretty groovy place.
Groovy.
Something else I really like about Wichita. Um, so if you know me decently, you know that I went to college in Buffalo, New York. And one of the things that Buffalo is famous for is grain elevators.
Yes.
At their peak, they had dozens of them lining the riverfront and the lakefront. Wichita is actually home to the world's largest grain elevator. The DeBruce Grain Incorporated elevator is currently listed in the Guinness Book of World Records as the largest grain elevator in the world. It's about a half a mile long in total. It consists of 246 individual 30-foot diameter concrete tanks. The structure has a capacity of over 20 million bushels of wheat, which is enough to supply all the bread consumed in the United States in a 6-week period.
Wow.
So, as the railroads became, king in the late 19th century, Wichita also became a very important hub for the grain industry. Because of course you're in the heartland, and you've got the farms everywhere. So, as a center for shipping off your product to the markets on the coast, this was a place to do that. And grain elevators, of course, were developed as a means of storing massive quantities of product before they could be put onto rail cars and shipped to wherever they needed to go. So yeah,
Wow. Just looking at
even when you drive around Wichita today, it kind of reminds me of Buffalo a little bit because of the industry on the north side of town there. Um, there's plenty of those big structures dotting the landscape.
that's amazing. I'm just looking at this photo of the grain elevator. It is massive.
Yeah, they're engineering achievements in themselves.
Yes, they were.
What the material that goes into build it, and then the technology involved in regulating them and maintaining the flow of product in and out. It's really fascinating stuff.
It is. It really is.
Something else that I think some people might find really interesting is the Keeper of the Plains, which
Yeah.
is a 44-foot tall sculpture located at the confluence of the Arkansas and Little Arkansas rivers right downtown. It's across from what's now known as the Mid America All Indian Center, and it was built in 1974 to commemorate the indigenous population of southern Kansas. And the Keeper of the Plains is part of a smaller campus that sort of incorporates a lot of historical. It's kind of like a walking museum of sorts. Um, and there are live, reenactments and displays that are part of this as well. There are fire pits at the base of this monument that are lit every night. So if you happen to be here after dark, that's something that's I'm told is a pretty interesting thing to see. Um, it is nice to see a place like Wichita embracing their past and their and honoring the indigenous population that was here long before the modern day settlers showed up.
I agree. Wow. This is such wow. Just looking at the photos, this is so cool. I'm really glad that they built this to honor the indigenous population as well.
Yeah, yeah. And of course, as part of this, there are pedestrian bridges that cross the two rivers right upriver from their confluence, which are pretty
Yes.
neat.
Yes, those are neat and especially neat with the monument there too.
Mm-hmm. We will see a picture showing all of that later on in this PowerPoint. Oh, here it is, actually. So yeah, I actually didn't know about this. I stumbled on it by accident. Um, then I was wondering what this was, and as I learned more about it and explored it a little bit, I thought it was really neat, and I wanted to share it with you guys.
So cool.
Yeah. All right. So on the roads front, there's a few things going on here, as you can see on the map. So what we're looking at is Wichita Metro. I-35 comes in from the south at the bottom of your screen and departs to the northeast, all along the Kansas Turnpike. Interstate 135 and 235 are also a part of the Wichita landscape. 135 passes right through the middle of town and heads north towards I-70 near Salina. 235 being the western bypass. U.S. Route 400 also runs east to west. That's the main east-west freeway in Wichita. And there are a couple other highways as well, which we'll touch on as well. K96, for example, being chief among those. But I want to start with the Kansas Turnpike, which I think rightfully so has been described as the main street of Kansas. So in the years after World War II, we think of the turnpike system and the turnpike movement as being more of an East Coast thing. But Kansas got the idea for a toll road of their own to connect Kansas City with Topeka and Wichita, um, to be built in the style of those eastern turnpikes. The high speed limits, few interchanges, and also service plazas, at intervals to allow motorists to stop without having to leave the turnpike proper. So Kansas developed their turnpike system right around the same time as a lot of the states in the Northeast did. The turnpike was completed in between Kansas City Metro and the Oklahoma state line in its entirety in 1956. There was a little bit of a problem, though, because down this way at the southern end, they were trying to coordinate with Oklahoma because Oklahoma had designs on building a turnpike of their own to connect Oklahoma City with the southern end of the Kansas Turnpike. However, Oklahoma stalled. They didn't get their turnpike off the ground, and Kansas was already full speed ahead on theirs. So Kansas ended their turnpike literally at the state line of Oklahoma. And there's a very famous scene there where the turnpike just sort of dead ends at this farm road, which is located right at the Oklahoma border. It was actually set up that way for about 2 years after the turnpike opened. The southern terminus was basically this dead end in the middle of nowhere. And motorists actually, on numerous occasions, failed to notice that the highway was ending because it was such an abrupt conclusion to the highway that they just ran right off the road into the cornfield beyond.
Wow.
And so eventually what they did was they closed off that southernmost 4 miles or so and forced all traffic to exit at that first interchange in Kansas. They kept the dead end there, but it just wasn't open to traffic anymore. Oklahoma never ended up building their turnpike. What ended up happening was this was also the dawn of the federal aid highway program. And so Oklahoma said, well, why build a turnpike when we can just tap into federal funds and build our highway as part of the interstate highway system? Which is what they eventually did. And Interstate 35 was built north to south through Oklahoma. Although it's interesting to know that that highway was originally planned as a toll road. So I-35 was eventually incorporated into the Kansas Turnpike system. 35 was originally a separate highway in Kansas, but it was eventually incorporated for I think mainly for simplicity's sake. As we go to this slide here, this shows you the Kansas Turnpike system, and for I don't know if I think about half of its length it follows Interstate 35. They are a concurrency together, coming out of Oklahoma to Wichita and then turning northeast to Emporia, which is where 35 departs the turnpike and is a freeway the rest of the way to Kansas City. Same story with I-70. I think 70 was supposed to be a separate highway originally, but they just decided to route it onto the turnpike for simplicity's sake. And by the way, there was no real logic to building two parallel freeways, one tolled and one not. They weren't about to try to tempt fate with starting a fight with the Kansas Turnpike Authority, so they just routed the interstate onto the turnpike. The section that between Emporia and Topeka, you will notice, is signed as I-335, and that was not part of the original interstate system. In fact, that section of the turnpike for over 30 years was not part of the interstate system. That came much later. The national maximum speed limit law, which was established in 1974, mandated a maximum speed of 55 miles an hour. However, a future amendment to that allowed the signage of rural interstate highways to 65 miles an hour. Now, Kansas and the Turnpike Authority in particular wanted to be able to sign the entirety of the turnpike as 65 miles an hour, but they couldn't do that without it being part of the interstate system. So in 1987, the Federal Highway Administration granted an exemption, I guess you could say, to allow an interstate to be designated along this section of the Kansas Turnpike. And so that's how I-335 came to be. So we have an interstate highway that was created because they wanted to raise the speed limit. And that's how 335 happened. That's how I-88 in Illinois came to be. Because that was a tollway that was not signed to 65 under the original national maximum speed limit law. And I believe the upper end of the main turnpike north of Portland was another one that was originally not signed as an interstate. It was given the designation originally as 495. Now it's a part of I-95. I think those are the three examples of that. So it's funny how our interstate system happens. You know, like sometimes there are these odd technicalities or odd quirks that happen throughout history, and Kansas is home to one of these with I-335. But yeah, the turnpike itself hasn't changed too much. I mean, in the Wichita area, certainly it's seen its share of expansion. It has not been widened. It's always been 2 lanes each direction. There have been a few interchanges added over the years. The other big development in more recent times is the addition of the cashless tolling program, which was gradually put into place between 2022 and late 2024. And as of the recording of this episode, the Kansas Turnpike system is in fact completely cashless. So that's the turnpike out of the way. Now, as I promised earlier, I was going to talk about the highway, the section of US 81 I have driven on. So let's talk about I-135, which is actually co-signed with US 81 for practically all of its length between Wichita and Salina. In the Wichita area, it is the main north-south freeway through the middle of town and southward to the turnpike and heading north into the industrial north side of town and then beyond towards I-70. The highway actually was originally designated as Interstate 35W in 1976 when construction was underway. Because this is what happened in the early years. You know, we love to put lettered suffixes on mainline interstates. That was a thing in the 50s and 60s. However, in 1976, that was phased out. And the 1970s is when most of the lettered suffixed routes were eliminated in the system. So not just here, but also all over the country. Like all the interstate, like I-80Ns and I-80Ss and I-76N, whatever it was. Like all that stuff was eliminated in the 70s with the exception of 35E and W in Dallas-Fort Worth and the same route combination up in Minneapolis-St. Paul. Those were the two exceptions that were granted. Now, of course, we're seeing a bit of a resurgence of this in recent years, especially in Texas.
Yes.
Looking at you, Interstate 69. There's... I don't know what people think about that. I think it was the right move to eliminate a lot of that stuff in the first place. I feel like adding lettered suffixes just creates the opportunity for more confusion more than anything else.
I personally, I get it in a situation like Dallas-Fort Worth and Minneapolis-St. Paul when you have these sort of like twin cities and you don't want to like pick one over the other to have the main route.
Yeah, I think those are I think they were wise to keep those because those are really the only two when you look at the roster that made sense to keep.
Yeah.
Because once like this original 35W designation here in Wichita made no sense whatsoever because you were never going to tie back into I-35 at the end unless you were going to go hundreds of miles out of your way. So
exactly.
Yeah, those are the kinds of things that needed to be eliminated from the system, and fortunately they were. I-135 as it stands today is currently the longest interstate in the system that has an odd first digit. So, being a 135, it's a spur. I believe it's 96 miles or so. There are other interstates, there are other auxiliary interstates that are longer, but 135 is the longest three-digit spur route in the system. The full length was completed between Wichita and Salina in December 1979. Now, in Wichita proper, there were a few different alignments that were considered. Before I get to that, I'll show you these pictures here. This is the recent reconstruction in the upper left of the 135-235 exchange on the north side of town. I've actually been through Wichita, I think 3 different times in the last few years. So each time I've been through town, I've seen a different iteration of this interchange. But the picture in the upper left shows the more or less finished arrangement with the very loud and obnoxious arrows in that arrow per lane assembly, which I think is awesome. I think there need to be more signs like that on our freeways around this country.
I like that sign a lot.
I do. Isn't that badass?
It's so badass.
APLs are very polarizing nowadays, but I mean, it's the reason they're there is obvious. It's because our population is gradually aging, and so things need to be delineated that much more visibly. And so I think that moving to this sort of system instead of the traditional diagrammic signage of the past, I think is the right move. Now, these things sort of ebb and flow. So like APLs are all the rage this generation, but I would expect in future generations or like another generation from now, we'll be doing something else. You know, like maybe we revert back to what we did before, or maybe we try something completely different. Um, Without going down the rabbit hole of why signs are designed in the way they are, that's sort of my 2 cents on that.
Yep.
In Wichita proper, there were several alignments that were considered for the routing of I 135. What they settled on eventually was an alignment that paralleled and basically absorbed the old Chisholm Creek Canal, which is why this highway was known as the Canal Route when it was being planned. In fact, the canal, as you see in this picture, is routed right down the median of the highway. And the reason it's elevated is because so much of Wichita was conceived and was built in what is now known to be a floodplain on the Arkansas River. And we'll talk more about some of the flood measures that the city has undertaken over the years in a little bit. But construction on 135 through Wichita really got underway in 1971, taking 8 years to complete, and it was built through the middle of the city's historic African American neighborhood, which was known as McAdams. McAdams was basically cut in half by the construction of the highway. There are a couple of historic landmarks in the neighborhood still today, such as the Dunbar Theater, which, yeah, let's go to this slide so I can show you that. So the Dunbar Theater is the picture in the lower left. The theater holds a special place in the memories of many people in Wichita, as it was once one of the centerpieces or the hubs of that community during the 1940s and 50s. The Dunbar Theater was constructed in 1941, and until 1963, it was the only movie theater in Wichita that was available to the African American community. There is other green space in McAdams that remains today. In fact, I do want to mention, before I let you take over, Laura, for a second, that Wichita is also the home of NFL Hall of Famer Barry Sanders. And he grew up in Wichita. I don't remember if he grew up in McAdams or if he was somewhere else, but there is a prominent football field in McAdams today named for him. So I wanted to mention that.
Very cool. But as you said, McAdams was split by construction of the I-135 freeway, with many businesses closing and residential housing falling into disrepair. So in the early 1970s, the city government conducted generalized planning for urban renewal in McAdams, focusing on the industrial corridor that had developed along its western edge. In the early 2000s, community activists began working with the city government to reinvest in the neighborhood and improve quality of life, which led to the creation of a formal revitalization plan in 2003. Why it's named McAdams? So the neighborhood was named for Emerson McAdams, who took on many roles at what was known as McKinley Park in Northeast Wichita. Please, no one tell the current administration don't want this renamed back to McKinley, like other landmarks. But basically, Emerson McAdams was known as, somebody who, practically lived at the park and was constantly there, cutting the grass, chaperoning dances, fishing out snakes at the swimming pool, being there for breaking sand on the golf course. There used to be a golf course there prior to the construction of the Interstate. But basically, he died very suddenly in October 1965, and the Wichita Park Board and City Council approved a petition to rename McKinley Park. That was previously named in honor of the assassinated 25th U.S. President in McAdams' honor. So the park was renamed first, and it's unclear exactly when the surrounding neighborhood also adopted the name as McAdam. But it also, but that name goes back in documents at least as far as 1975. But he was known as somebody who had, a lot of respect, a lot of influence on, teens and everyone in the neighborhood. But yes, the adjoining McKinley Golf Course was also renamed in his honor until that was eliminated in 1971. But the McAdams Golf Club, which is reportedly one of the oldest African American golf clubs in the country, remains active. I was looking through some plans, and it looks like there have been lots of different plans to build upon, revitalize McAdams Park over the years, which is very good.
It is interesting that even in a city that's as far flung as Wichita, we still come across the same themes with urban planning, urban renewal, and where we place our highways. And I mean, you could really draw names out of a hat at this point. You could put any big city in America, and whatever name you pick out, you'll find if you look deep enough, you'll find a lot of the same things were going on. From a decision making point of view. So I would say that I'm pleased to see that a place like the Dunbar is still around. I know that there's been a movement the last few years to secure funding for its full rehabilitation. So stay tuned on that. That's a work in progress, and we'll see how that goes in the future. But I think it goes to show that the construction of highways has a permanent effect on communities, and you can do anything you want to try to erase the mistake, but the mistake remains in the future. Even if you erase the highway, you never bring back really the prosperity of a neighborhood before the highway even went in the first place. And I think the McAdams is just another example of that. It's something that I certainly keep in mind, and I don't know what our viewers think about that, but maybe leave your thoughts in the comments below if you have something to add.
Yeah, and as you said, that you see these themes all across the country, as far as when these roadways were constructed, but you also see themes of, I guess, trying to right some wrongs. As I mentioned about how there's been different planning efforts that happen. They got a comprehensive, plan about 2 decades ago. One of the most recent projects involved putting new bike lanes and on the northern edge of McAdams Park. And there's apparently also some like little league facilities that have gone in near the park. And so there's been lots of efforts to, kind of, I guess, make improvements and not leave these neighborhoods, in this state of disrepair after the highways come in. That it's like, oh, okay, well, why don't we do things to help, reinvigorate these communities.
All fair points,
Mm-hmm.
Moving right along, we have I-235 to discuss, the West Belt Line as it was known on planning maps. I don't know that people ever refer to it as such nowadays, but that is what it was known as, I think, before it was even part of the interstate system. It was the first non-turnpike highway to be completed in Wichita. The vast majority of its length was completed in the early 60s and opened to traffic by 1962. The final connections to neighboring highways were made by 1965. Originally, the 235 designation extended all the way to the Turnpike. Like that southern mile of I-135 was originally signed as I-235. However, it was then reposted as I-35W. You may recall how that was the original designation. And then finally to I-135 by the late 1970s. So that 1 mile piece of interstate there at the south end of 235 was actually 3 different designations over the course of its history. In 2021, work began to completely rebuild the northern 135-235 crossroads in North Wichita. The centerpiece of this was a 2-lane flyover ramp connecting northbound 135 to southbound 235, and that was completed in 2023. Now, it's important to point out that a lot of 235 around the west side of Wichita parallels what's known as the Mitchell Floodway, which a lot of locals refer to as the Big Ditch. Its formal name is the Wichita Valley Center Floodway, and it's a drainage canal, basically, that allows the Army Corps of Engineers to drain and divert floodwater from the Arkansas River and the Chisholm Creek around the west side of Wichita and redischarge it into the Arkansas River further downriver from the city. There have been several major flood events in Wichita since it was founded in 1870. Particularly devastating floods took place in the years 1877, 1904, 1916, 1923, and 1944. So flood events in the Arkansas Basin were fairly common in this area at the time, and so the Mitchell Project was developed as a means to save the center of the city from flood damage and divert water away from the city during times of spring thaw or heavy seasonal rains or what have you. The Mitchell Floodway Project was built in the 1950s, and it continues to be an integral part of the flood control system in this part of the Arkansas Basin to this day. The floodway itself is named for local engineer M.S. Mitchell. Mitchell served as the city flood control superintendent from 1964 to 1979, and he was a contributing engineer into the design work around the construction of the floodway. The name of the floodway was officially changed to the Mitchell Floodway following his death in 2017. Okay, so U.S. Route 400. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but yes, you are correct that there is a U.S. highway numbered 400, and no, there is not a U.S. Highway 0, which means that this highway officially violates AASHTO numbering convention, as, the number would suggest that it is a spur off of U.S. Route 0, and of course, as I said, there is no U.S. 0. So 400 is sort of one of those weird outliers in the numbering system of the U.S. highway system. In Wichita itself, it's mostly a concurrency with US 54. Construction in the late 2010s, early 2020s completely made over this corridor. It was originally a very antiquated freeway, new interchanges. The main line was expanded to 6 lanes per direction in a project that was wrapped up in 2021. So when I got to drive it, they had basically just completed the makeover. So it looks pretty cool. It gets you where you need to go in a hurry. Kellogg Avenue, which was the name of this freeway, and it was the surface street that the freeway replaced. It was named for a gentleman named Milo Kellogg. No, not the Kellogg who's on the name of your cereal boxes. Not that guy. This gentleman, this Kellogg, was the city of Wichita's first civilian postmaster and founder of the Kellogg Switchboard and Supply Company, an American manufacturer of telecommunication equipment established in 1897 in Chicago, and intended to produce telephone exchange equipment and telephone apparatus. Kellogg's business, as you might imagine, really boomed in the early 20th century, providing the bulk of the nation's telephone equipment until after World War II. And since he's Wichita's own, he gets a freeway named after him. Now, those of you who are taking a break from the fictional highways section of the AA Roads Forum, I'd like to spend a moment talking about that other I-66, because this was one of those sort of bizarre plans that came about not all that long ago, actually, like 30 years ago or so. So I-66, as we know, runs from Washington, D.C. into Western Virginia, and it currently ends at I-81, where there were grandiose plans back in the 90s and 2000s that would have extended I-66 all the way out to Wichita, Kansas. I mean, there's a short version of this that I could give you, which is that the only state that really took this seriously and really considered building most of it out was Kentucky, and parts of the section that were designated for I-66 are part of the future interstate system, in fact, but not under the I-66 number. The other states really weren't all that interested. The proposal really didn't go anywhere. West Virginia had zero interest in it at all, which is a big part of why it never really got off the planning board in general. So 66, it would have extended, it would have roughly paralleled the US 400 corridor all the way out to Joplin, Missouri, and then followed a new alignment, eastward from there somehow to get it into Kentucky. But it's one of those kind of goofy little short-lived ideas. They called it the I-66 Trans-America Corridor. They gave it this fancy name, but it's one of those interesting curios that I think will always remain a what-if and will always remain a hypothetical more than anything else.
Yeah, I would love to talk about it some more.
Okay.
Yeah, I've got a bunch of notes on this. So basically, what was built of U.S. Route 400 is 481 miles, about 481 miles long, that almost entirely in Kansas. And basically, it was first, it was part of this this larger plan, because the proposal for the westward extension of I-66 was started by business interests in Wichita, Kansas. The choice for the number I-66 was also, a hope to capitalize on the name association with decommissioned Route 66. And so then Congress decided to create the East-West Trans-America Highway High Priority Corridor 3 in the Intermodal Surface Transportation Efficiency Act of 1991, also known as ICE-T 1991. But the Trans-America Feasibility Study concluded that the nationwide highway was not economical with little traffic benefit. But that didn't stop Kansas from building their section. So their 481 mile section was first established on December 1st, 1994. And at the time, the first section of it ran from the east end of the US 50 US 83 overlap eastward to the East County line of Cherokee County, Kansas. But yeah, so the highway's western terminus, now is in Granada, Colorado at an intersection with US 385, and the eastern terminus is southwest of Joplin, Missouri, near Loma Linda, at an interchange with I-44, which it shares with US 166. But yeah, so so basically, so Congress basically limited the I-66 designation only to the section of the Trans-America Corridor from the then planned I-73, I-74 conversion of the US 52 King Coal Highway in West Virginia through Kentucky, Illinois, terminating at I-57 in Missouri. So yeah, ultimately, future I-66 would have remained disconnected from the existing one. It was supported in Kentucky mainly because of the efforts of Representative Hal Rogers. But when the Kentucky Transportation Cabinet completed its feasibility study in 2005, they concluded it was too costly, had little traffic benefit, and had no eastern terminus because I-73, I-74 had little chance of completion in West Virginia.
Yeah.
And that there was a high potential environmental impact in the Daniel Boone National Forest. So they ultimately turned it into a low priority wish list project, which effectively canceled it. So basically, since the Sunflower State couldn't generate enough interest with other states to build the route, AASHTO offered US 400 as a way to sort of appease Kansas. Like, oh, we'll still give you something special. So we can honor that you have a super special highway that doesn't really go with either system. So it's it's very interesting because yeah, what would you otherwise number it? Yeah, and it's a very, I guess, if you have any ideas, audience, please, comment, rate a comment, mention something in the live chat because I'd be curious. If not US 400, what should it be?
I think it should be Interstate
Um,
400.
ooh,
Just go for broke,
oh,
man.
just do it.
Yeah.
But but apparently, business and local political interests in Cape Girardeau, Missouri, were also advocating for the I-66 Trans-America corridor, but there are absolutely no plans in the US DOT FHWA to fund the concept after FHWA canceled any further studies in 2015.
Yeah, so this plan has been dead for a while, and I don't expect it to be revived at any point. The engineer in me is kind of sad because it would be neat to see more interstate highway bridges on the Mississippi and Ohio rivers, but other than that, it's really it's one of those dotted lines on a map that never really had much of a chance, as far as I can tell.
Yeah.
So, so that's the brief history of that other I-66 that a lot of people don't know about, but now you know. Um,
Yeah. It's something I knew about as a road geek actually pretty early on in my young Laura research of highways.
oh, really?
Yeah, it was sort of one of those fictional highways that really stood out to me. Like, ooh, I-66 could continue.
Well, because that makes sense though, because in the early 2000s, that's when you and I were really discovering the community, and we were really starting to get into researching this stuff. So, and that's when some of these feasibility studies were happening, especially in Kentucky. So,
Yep.
yeah, it does make sense that you would have come across that relatively early.
Yep.
Um, yeah, God only knows if we'll ever see I-74 in West Virginia. I doubt it, but
Yeah,
yeah,
I also doubt it.
I don't think Rainey will either. But you never know.
You never know.
Um, Honorable mentions, we have a couple of them. I do want to mention K96 real quick. So, when you were looking at the map earlier, you saw that sort of the northeastern quadrant of Wichita Metro was covered by the K96 freeway. Um, it sort of forms a northern arc because it overlaps also with I 235 in the northwest quadrant before it branches off again to the west. In fact, if you follow K96 out of Wichita, it's a continuous designation that runs all the way out to the Colorado state line where it becomes Colorado Highway 96. And if you follow that, that takes you west of I 25, west of Pueblo, Colorado, and into the Front Range. So you could follow this road all the way for quite a while, actually, and find yourself in the middle of the Rockies.
Wow.
And with that, we've come to the end of the proceedings for tonight. So, Laura, did you have anything you wanted to get off your chest? Any grievances you wanted to air before we wrap this up?
No, I mean, I think I said my piece earlier about how please current presidential administration do not change the name of McAdams Park back.
We're going to name everything for President McKinley now.
Everything.
Everything.
But other than that, I don't have any grievances. I think I'm good.
All right. Yeah. I mean, I've said everything I came here to say, so that's all I got.
That's all I
Um,
got too.
all right. So that was Laura Bianca Pruitt, who was helping me out of mdroads.com. Thank you very much to Laura for being a part of tonight's program. And thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you have, why not subscribe to the channel, leave a like, leave a comment if you haven't already. Check out the Kansas Highways playlist on the channel if you'd like to see more content from all across the Sunflower State, including Wichita and some of the other big cities that Kansas is known for. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.